On January 2nd, 1941, as the roar of artillery echoed across the barren landscape of Bardia, Libya, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The British Eighth Army, advancing relentlessly from El Alamein, had encircled the Italian defences. For the Italian soldiers stationed there, including Coriolano Gino Caprara, the war had reached a brutal and inevitable conclusion. After weeks of siege, with dwindling food supplies and constant bombardment, the inevitable surrender became the only option for survival. Caprara, a young frontier guard, recalled the confusion and chaos of those final hours. "We had nothing left. We were starving, and the bombs were falling around us. There was no choice but to surrender. We had to accept it, even though every part of us resisted." Alongside him were thousands of other Italian soldiers, exhausted from months of fighting and constant retreat. As the British advanced, the prisoners were marched barefoot, their feet shredded by the unforgiving terrain. The relentless heat of the desert and the emotional toll of defeat weighed heavily on them. "We were soldiers. We had fought for our country, but now we were just prisoners," Caprara later reflected. At Agami 5 camp in Alexandria, Egypt, the Italian prisoners were held for a brief period before their transportation to Britain. The conditions in the camp were grim. The prisoners were given minimal rations, and food was often withheld as a form of punishment for any signs of loyalty to Mussolini or the fascist regime. Caprara recalled the bitter frustration of hunger. "We would sing Italian songs, old fascist anthems, just to stay connected to our past, but it cost us. The bread was withheld, the food scraps became our reward. Despite the hardships, there was a camaraderie among the men. Even when the rations were low, we shared whatever little we had. We shared the bread, the little water, because that's all we had left, each other," Caprara explained. There was a defiance in the air, a stubborn will to survive, but also an underlying fear of the unknown. For the soldiers, the journey to Britain was another phase of their captivity. They were packed into cargo ships, tightly crammed together with no space to move. The ship was a floating prison, and the stench of unwashed bodies and damp wood filled the air. "We thought the war would end before we got there," recalled one POW, Antonio Mancini, a fellow soldier captured at Bardia. "But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The only thing worse than the heat of the desert was the suffocating heat of the holds. We were suffocating, and the smell was unbearable." The journey across the Mediterranean was harrowing. The POWs, many of whom were already weak from the desert campaign, found themselves even more vulnerable on these ships. Mancini remembered, "There were some men who pretended to be ill just to get fresh air on deck. It wasn't about being sick, it was about survival. We didn't know if we'd survive the journey or the unknown that awaited us on the other side." After a prolonged and agonizing voyage, the prisoners finally arrived in Liverpool, Britain, on January 10, 1942. The cold air of England was a shock to the men who had known only the relentless heat of North Africa. "We couldn't believe it. It was so cold," Caprara recalled. "We came from the desert, from the heat, and now we were here in the cold of England. We thought they were sending us to die." The British guards, who had greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and professionalism, stood in stark contrast to the men's image of their captors. They expected brutality, or at least indifference, but instead, they faced what seemed like basic courtesy. In the early days at the camp, the soldiers struggled to make sense of their new reality. They were no longer in the heat of battle, yet they were far from free. The men spent their first days in a daze. "At first I thought it was just a trick. I thought the British were deceiving us," said Giuseppe Ricci, another Italian POW. "But then I realized we weren't being treated as the enemy. We were being treated as men. It was so strange." The POWs were transported to Camp 34 on the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. This remote, isolated location was far from the battlefields of North Africa. As the POWs were herded into the camp, the sight of the barbed wire fences and the soldiers guarding them brought a sense of finality to their situation. They were, after all, prisoners of war. But the first surprise came quickly. Unlike the cruelty of German POW camps, the conditions in British camps were somewhat bearable. For many Italians, this was a stark contrast to what they had imagined. Ricci described his first night in the camp. "We had no idea what to expect. But the British Guards, although they were soldiers, they treated us like human beings. They gave us food, they spoke to us, they didn't yell at us or hit us. This treatment was a revelation. The prisoners had expected brutality, forced labor, and relentless punishment. They had been prepared for the worst, but they found something different. Food, while limited, was provided consistently, and the men were allowed to engage in work programs. Their duties varied from maintenance crews to construction projects, with some assigned to work on the Churchill Barriers, a key defense project to protect the British naval base at Scapa Flow. The work was tough, but it gave the POWs a sense of purpose. They began to see their captors not as enemies, but as fellow soldiers, bound by the same fate in this global conflict. The Italians in the camp began to form a new kind of bond with the British soldiers. Caprara noted, "At first we were so wary of each other. We were enemies after all. But as we spent more time together, we began to share stories, to talk. Slowly we saw that we weren't all that different." The realization that the British soldiers had been just as affected by the war as they had been, and were in fact in similar positions, created an unspoken understanding between the two groups. For the Italians, this was a moment of deep transformation. The shock they felt upon arriving in Britain, believing they would be treated with cruelty, dehumanized or discarded, was quickly replaced by a profound sense of relief and even hope. In their new, strange surroundings, they began to see that humanity could still exist even in the most difficult of circumstances. Caprara, reflecting on his early days at the camp, said, "It was hard to believe at first. How could the people we had fought against treat us like this? But the British were not our enemies here. They were just people, like us, caught in the same war." The realization was jarring for many. The enemies they had once considered monstrous had become the source of their unexpected survival. As the days wore on at Camp 34, the initial shock of being treated with respect by their British captors began to settle into something more profound: camaraderie. The Italian prisoners, once consumed by suspicion and distrust, began to interact more openly with the British soldiers. It was not without hesitation, but the steady progression of time allowed for a delicate form of communication to blossom. Many Italians, like Coriolano Caprara, found themselves baffled by the unspoken mutual respect growing between them and their captors. "I remember the first time I spoke to a British soldier without feeling the weight of hatred," Caprara reflected. "It wasn't a grand moment. It was just a simple exchange about the weather. But in that moment, I realized we weren't just enemies anymore. We were two men caught in the same war." The British soldiers too began to show a level of curiosity about the men they had once fought against. There were attempts at conversation, tentative exchanges of stories, and an increasing willingness to share basic human experiences. Antonio Mancini, another prisoner at the camp, recalled one such moment. "I was tasked with repairing a fence one day when a British guard walked over to ask how I was doing. I was so used to being treated like dirt that at first I didn't know how to respond. But he smiled, and that was the start of something. It didn't change everything, but it made me rethink how I saw him." Through these small moments, a new sense of connection started to emerge. The work on the Churchill Barriers gave the prisoners something to focus on, and many of them began to take pride in the labor. They were no longer just prisoners. They were men rebuilding their lives brick by brick. For the Italians, the act of contributing to the construction of such a significant project gave them a small sense of agency in their otherwise powerless situation. But there was more to their transformation than just work. As the weather turned colder, many of the POWs were allowed to engage in recreational activities that had previously seemed unimaginable in the brutal confines of war. Caprara, who had always been musically inclined, joined the camp's drum band. Music became a form of expression and an emotional outlet for the prisoners. "When I played the drums, I could forget for a while that I was a prisoner," he recalled. "It was a small piece of freedom. Music reminded me of home, of better times." The camp also had its share of social events, sports games, dances, and even performances put on by the POWs for the British Guards. Football games became a staple of camp life, with Italian POWs often facing off against British soldiers in friendly matches. These games, initially filled with tension and uncertainty, began to shift. Mancini, who had once considered football an insignificant distraction, found himself eagerly participating. At first, I played to pass the time, but soon I was playing to win. The camaraderie on the field was something we all looked forward to. We were still at war, but we had moments of normalcy. The sports events and band performances brought the Italians and the British closer together. The difference between the two groups, once sharply defined by national identity and the harsh reality of warfare, began to blur in these moments of shared humanity. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners saw their captors as more than just enemy soldiers. They saw them as individuals caught in a similar fate, trying to make it through the war just as they were. The most profound change, however, was internal. Many of the Italian prisoners began to re-evaluate their loyalty to Mussolini's fascist regime. For Caprara, this was the turning point. As the months passed and news of Italy's shifting allegiance reached them, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies in September of 1943. Effectively switching sides, Caprara and his fellow POWs were forced to confront their beliefs and their allegiances. "I remember the day we heard that Mussolini had fallen," Caprara said. "We didn't know how to react. We had been fighting under his banner for so long, but now we found ourselves in British camps, receiving treatment we didn't deserve. It made us question everything. Had we been fighting for the wrong cause all along?" This internal conflict was not unique to Caprara. Many Italian POWs began to question their role in the war, and some even chose to defect to the Allied side. Caprara was not among those who defected immediately, but his feelings of loyalty to Mussolini's regime began to erode. As he and others witnessed the British soldiers working alongside them, treating them with respect despite the ongoing war, the divide between fascism and the Allied cause seemed less clear-cut. "The British weren't our enemies here," Caprara reflected. "They were just soldiers like us. We had all been caught up in something bigger than us." While the POW's transformation was not instant, the longer-term consequences of their captivity began to play out. The British treatment, which had initially been a shock to the Italian soldiers, had begun to break down barriers. Their captors were no longer seen as oppressors. They were viewed as allies in a shared struggle against the horrors of war. For many of the Italian prisoners, Camp 34 became a place of reflection, of re-evaluating their past actions and decisions. The camp, far from a place of permanent imprisonment, became a place for personal growth and the reconstruction of their identities. They began to see that their humanity was not defined by their nationality or their allegiance to a fallen leader, but by their actions and their ability to connect with others in the face of adversity. For Caprara, the gradual shift from enemy to cooperator was just beginning. He and many others would go on to play significant roles in supporting the British war effort, in the process proving that the line between enemy and ally could be far more fluid than anyone had imagined. As the days turned into months and the reality of their new lives in Britain began to sink in, Caprara looked around and realized just how far he and his fellow prisoners had come. They had arrived at the camp as defeated soldiers, with little hope for the future. But now they had become something more. They had become men willing to rebuild and redefine their futures. As time progressed in Camp 34, the transformation within the Italian POWs was not merely one of physical adjustment to their new lives, but also a profound shift in their sense of identity and loyalty. By the latter half of 1943, as news of Italy's surrender to the Allies reverberated through the camp, the dynamic between the Italian POWs and their British captors began to evolve into something more complex. It was a dramatic departure from the traditional adversarial relationship they had once shared on the battlefield. For many of the POWs, particularly Caprara, the fall of Mussolini and the subsequent armistice marked a pivotal moment in their wartime experience. When Italy formally switched sides and began to cooperate with the Allies, the situation for many POWs became increasingly ambiguous. In some cases, men who had been captured by the British suddenly found themselves questioning their allegiance to Mussolini's fascist regime. Many of the POWs had fought in the North African campaign under the banner of the fascist Italian army, but the collapse of Mussolini's government forced them to reckon with the harsh reality of their circumstances. The more they interacted with the British, the more they began to realize that their captors were not the caricatured enemies they had been led to believe. The pivotal moment for Caprara came one cold afternoon in September, when news spread that Mussolini had fallen. We heard it over the radio one day. Mussolini had been deposed. For us, it was a moment of shock, Caprara reflected. It was as though the ground beneath our feet had suddenly shifted. We had fought and suffered under his regime, but now the world was changing. As the prisoners digested the news, many began to reconsider their role in the conflict. The British Guards, who had once seemed like an imposing force of enemies, now appeared in a new light. There was no celebratory fanfare among the Italians upon hearing the news, just a quiet reflection on their place in the war. Antonio Mancini recalled, "At first I couldn't believe it. We had been taught to hate the British, to see them as the enemy. But when Italy changed sides, I began to see them differently. They weren't just soldiers on the other side, they were just people like us." Despite the shift in loyalty, not every Italian POW was ready to abandon their allegiances entirely. Some continued to cling to their fascist roots, refusing to accept the reality of Italy's changing position. They held on to the idea that Mussolini would return to power, or that the Axis forces might regroup. However, for many others, particularly the younger soldiers like Caprara, the collapse of Mussolini's government was the final blow to their former ideological beliefs. Caprara recalled, "I had been loyal to Italy, loyal to Mussolini, but now I couldn't ignore what was happening. The British weren't our enemies anymore. The war had taken so much from us, and it had opened my eyes to the truth." As these realizations began to take root, a handful of Italian POWs began to actively seek ways to cooperate with the British. Some offered their skills and services to the British Army, volunteering to work in communications, maintenance, and other support roles. Caprara himself began to take on tasks that required a greater degree of responsibility, including working as an interpreter for the British. His ability to speak both Italian and basic English became a valuable asset in the increasingly complex interactions between the prisoners and their captors. One of the most striking developments during this period was the way the British soldiers began to see the POWs. Initially, many of the British Guards viewed the Italians with a mixture of contempt and suspicion as members of the enemy camp. But as the months passed, and as the Italians began to engage in more cooperative work, the British soldiers started to recognize the humanity in their prisoners. Private William Thatcher, one of the British soldiers stationed at Camp 34, remembered, "I wasn't sure what to think at first. They were the enemy. But as we worked alongside them, we began to see that we were all in the same situation. We were soldiers just trying to survive. The Italians, they weren't what we expected." The sense of mutual respect was growing, and this was particularly evident in the prisoners' involvement with the British cultural programs. Many of the Italian POWs became involved in setting up sports tournaments, organizing concerts, and even producing Italian films to screen for the British soldiers. These efforts created an environment where the divisions between captor and prisoner started to blur, and there was a growing sense of community and shared purpose. Caprara, who had started to build a rapport with the British Guards and fellow prisoners, found that the camp's atmosphere was shifting rapidly. "At first, I could never have imagined becoming friends with the British," he admitted, "but as we worked together and shared meals, I started to realize that we weren't so different after all. We were all just soldiers, trying to make it through the war." By late 1944, the situation had evolved even further. Caprara and many of his fellow Italian POWs were officially reclassified as cooperators by the British authorities. This reclassification meant that they would no longer be treated as standard prisoners of war, but as men who could be trusted to contribute to the British war effort. They were given more freedom, and many of them were put to work in various non-combat roles. Caprara himself was assigned to a British battalion, where he was given a British uniform and assigned to various administrative tasks. He had effectively switched sides in the war. This shift in loyalty was not without its challenges. Some of the older, more conservative Italian POWs continued to resist any notion of cooperation with the British. They clung to their old allegiances, reluctant to accept that Mussolini's regime had fallen. But for Caprara and many others, this transformation was an opportunity to redeem themselves in their own eyes and to play a role in the Allied effort. It was also during this time that Caprara's relationship with the Wiley family, who lived near the camp, deepened. The Wiley family, who had initially been wary of the Italians, began to invite the prisoners to their home for tea and meals. The bonds that were formed between the British civilians and the Italian POWs symbolized the larger reconciliation that was taking place on a personal level. "We shared more than just meals," Caprara said. "We shared our stories, our experiences. It wasn't just about war anymore, it was about humanity." As the war drew to a close, many of the Italian POWs found themselves on the verge of repatriation. By April of 1946, Caprara and the others were finally sent home, back to Italy, where the war had left deep scars. Their return was not celebrated as a victory, but as a somber reflection of the war's impact on both sides. Caprara, like many others, was harassed during his journey back to Italy, faced with the stigma of having been a prisoner and a cooperator with the British. However, the friendships that Caprara had formed, especially with men like Private Thatcher, endured long after the war's end. Caprara's wedding in 1951 was attended by his former captor, Ernest Goldsmith, symbolizing the lasting bond that had been forged under the harshest of circumstances. As Caprara remarked with a sense of irony, "To think, I could have killed you." It was a reflection of how the war had transformed not only their lives, but also their perceptions of each other. Caprara's journey, from a young soldier in the deserts of Libya to a British cooperator, illustrates the remarkable ability of individuals to change, adapt, and find humanity in the most unlikely of places. His story is a testament to the power of empathy, shared struggle, and the complex dynamics of war that go beyond traditional narratives of enemy and ally.